Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. Hello, everyone. And for this edition of the podcast, I have with me the ever delightful Dr. Sarah Myhill, who is no stranger to anyone with ME/CFS. She's one of the longest standing experts in the field. And today I get to talk to her about one of her particular passions, which is the Paleo-Ketogenic diet. So, Sarah, do you want to wax lyrical about the extraordinary capacities of this diet in relation to ME/CFS?
Well, when I am treating somebody who's got ME/CFS, I'm looking for mechanisms. I'm asking the question, why? And the Paleo-Ketogenic diet addresses more than one mechanism. First of all, it addresses the mechanism of allergy, because allergy, as I call it, kicks an immunological hole in the energy bucket and drives inflammation. It addresses the issue of the correct fuel in the tank, because our mitochondria like to be fueled by ketones in preference to sugars and carbohydrates. And running on from that, when you burn sugars and carbohydrates in mitochondria to generate energy, you produce a lot of free radicals. And free radicals are, for the biochemists that might do, they have an unpaired electron. They're very damaging. They accelerate the underlying aging process. They promote degeneration. They're bad news. By contrast, ketones burn with far fewer free radicals, and so they're much better for our overall health.
I know that you relate this, don't you, Sarah, to evolutionary biology and the importance of living in tune with the body as it evolved evolutionarily. So I'm wondering if you could set that up for the listeners as well about the evolutionary biology of the diet itself.
Indeed. Whenever I have a difficult question, I always go back to first principles, which is, and the obvious first principle is, what did we evolve to eat? And primitive man and primitive woman evolved to eat a diet that was obviously fresh, organic, locally sourced, all these basic things, but they were essentially hunter-gatherers. And most of the year they would have survived on hunting meat. Hunting meat, fish, maybe eggs, maybe insects, who knows what, but primarily, and those foods would be high in fat and low in carbohydrate. Of course, when humans, as humans evolved, they evolved in Africa on the equator, almost certainly, east coast of Africa, and then they migrated away from the equator. They migrated north, and as the further north they went, the greater the problem they had dealing with winter. Because, of course, when there's winter, there are none of the normal foods around. So a survival technique to help us deal with winter is to get fat. What happens in the autumn? We have a free harvest of food. There is a windfall of free fruit, free nuts, free seeds, free root vegetables or whatever. But obviously, with time, we got better at harvesting those because we became more agriculturally minded. But the fact of the matter is there was always an autumn harvest. And that autumn harvest is comprised largely of carbohydrate-based foods. As we start to eat those foods, it switches on a carbohydrate addiction gene, which means once we start eating them, we can't stop them. Now, guess what? I know I've got that in spades. Give me a biscuit, I want the whole packet. Give me a square of chocolate, I want the whole bar. I'm not satisfied with, a square of. So I know I have that carbohydrate addiction gene well, and many do. And so they would eat those foods in an addictive way and get fat. But of course, that autumn harvest would come to an end, and the foods would no longer be there. And then we would use that fat store to power us through the winter, to keep us warm. That allowed us to survive winter. Now, of course, what happens now with modern agriculture and supermarkets is we can access those foods all year round, and we go on eating them because we're addicted to them. We never switch off that carbohydrate addiction gene, and that is what drives so many pathologies of Western life. So it starts off often with chronic fatigue. And when I was working as a general practitioner in the 1980s, the most common consultation was the TATT, tired all the time complaint. And I now know that much of that would have been dietary driven, because it was in the early 1980s that suddenly the switch came for, we should be eating lots of carbohydrates and fats, very bad for you, blah, 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 which is, of course, complete nonsense. I was born in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970, where, it was go to work on an egg. And, my mum insisted that we always had, fried bread, bacon, eggs, sausage for breakfast, and that's what powered us through the day. And then suddenly the switch came to muesli and porridge and fruit juice and toast, and that's all bad news. That's all really not good for our health. That's all carbohydrate. So we have this carbohydrate addiction gene, and once people grasp that idea that these carbohydrates are so addictive, and once you start, you can't stop, and they appreciate that they are consuming carbohydrates in an addictive way, then that allows them to see really, where they're going wrong. And so the starting point of those carbohydrate diets is fatigue, the tired all the time, a diagnosis I was seeing. But the end point is heart disease, cancer, and dementia. And guess what? We are seeing epidemics of all those three things. And again, just to jump forward to the 21st century, we also know that those foods put us at risk of getting viral infections, of course, in particular COVID-19, that we're all very knowledgeable about now. And one of the things we know about COVID-19 epidemic is those people who are overweight or who are diabetic. And of course, that's what happens when you eat carbohydrates in an addictive way long-term. They're the ones that die from COVID-19. Those are major risk factors. They increase your risk of death 3 or 4-fold if you get the infection. So not only is it the starting point to treat chronic fatigue syndrome, it's also the starting point to stop you dying from viral infections in the interim and to protect you from getting cancer, heart disease, and dementia. So what this means is I can tell my patients with some confidence that once you're well from your chronic fatigue syndrome, you will live your life to its full potential. You will live it well, and you will live it healthily to our, well, not 70 years and 10. We all have the potential to get to maybe 90 or 100 years of age, and we don't get that far because we mess things up on the way. So,
And all the models of aging, most of the models of aging we're presented with, they're just appalling, aren't they, Sarah?
Absolutely. And guess what? I've never seen a fat centenarian. All the centenarians are slim, skinny, physically active, good brains on them. In fact, I look after one. There's an old boy who I look after who lives in my annex at the side there. Of course, I feed him and he has a Paleo-Ketogenic diet. He will be 101 this year, and his brain is sharp and he has no serious disease. So there's no question that the diet is highly effective.
Brilliant. So can you explain the diet to those who know nothing about it? So what's paleo about it? What's ketogenic about it? Why combine it? Why is the combination more powerful than these diets on their own?
Okay. Well, the first most important thing is it wants to be ketogenic, it wants to be low in carbohydrates. And that is, as I say, because carbohydrates are very damaging to the body. They're damaging to the body because when we burn them, we create a lot of free radicals. But also they're damaging because if we overwhelm the ability of the upper gut to digest carbohydrates, because I've jumped ahead of myself now, but the upper gut should be a sterile, digesting, carnivorous gut to help us deal with fat and protein. So my dog who's sitting next to me, it's a carnivorous gut. The lower bowel, by contrast, is a vegetarian gut. It's like the sheep, cows, horses, it's like their gut. It's a fermenting gut, and that allows us to deal with fiber, and the gut microbiome does much more good as well. But the upper gut should be sterile. If we consume a lot of sugars and carbohydrates, we overwhelm the ability of the upper gut to sterilize itself, and then it starts to ferment. And the fermenting upper gut is a disaster. Because first of all, if you ferment sugars and carbohydrates, then you will ferment them into toxic substances. It's called, the best example of this is yeast. So if you eat a fruit, and fruit, of course, is sugar, and the fruit is covered in yeast because all fruits are. It will ferment in the stomach, and that's called the auto-brewery syndrome. It will produce alcohol. It will produce a lot of alcohol, sufficient to give us, a foggy brain, can't think clearly. But it's not just ethyl alcohol that's produced. It's also propyl alcohol, butyl alcohol, hydrogen sulfide, aminoalkyl compounds, D-lactate, other noxious gases, so ammonia gases. So the upper fermenting gut is very bad news. And then the microbes themselves are a problem, because if you're a microbe and you have created a little ecological niche for yourself, you don't want anybody else to move in. So you produce toxins. So bacteria produce bacterial endotoxin. Fungi produce fungal mycotoxin, and that poisons us too. And the third problem here, well, more than the third problem, a third problem is that, we're taught at medical school, yes, microbes in the gut, there they remain, not true. We know those microbes can get from the gut into the bloodstream. And because they're not evolutionarily correct microbes, because we shouldn't have an upper fermenting gut, the immune system sees them, and that switches on immune reactions. And my guess is that this phenomenon describes so many modern pathologies like fibromyalgia, polymyalgia rheumatica, temporal arteritis, arthritis. All the inflammatory arthritides have an infectious driver from the gut, urticaria, intrinsic asthma, even psychosis. So the microbes themselves are switch on the immune system and cause damage. And then, of course, it's all compounded because if you're eating a nutritious diet with maybe some vitamins and minerals, and your upper gut is full of bacteria and yeast, then, they're hungry for these nutritional supplements as well. And believe you me, I see lots of people who come and see me and they spent a fortune on vitamins and minerals, and they're not getting the results because they're simply feeding these upper gut fermenters. In fact, they ferment more and they get symptoms of belching and bloating and reflux and heartburn and water brash and indigestion. These are all classical upper fermenting gut symptoms. So that's the first point is we have to go low carbohydrate in order to sort the gut out. And for so many conditions, well, in fact, for all conditions, until you get the gut right, until you get the digestion and the absorption right, nothing else is going to fall into place because you can't use the very nutrients that you need for healing and repair. So that's another reason why we have to be low carbohydrate. So that's the ketogenic bit. And then we have to cut out the gluten, grains, and the dairy products. Now, let's start with dairy products. These are not evolutionarily correct foods. Yes, they are vital for the young mammal to allow the young mammal to mature and to grow rapidly, but after that stage, they are positively dangerous for our health. So dairy products all contain growth promoters. Why? So the young mammal can grow very quickly. But if you're adult, the last thing you want to be doing is consuming growth promoters, because that's a risk factor for cancer. And if anybody wants to read about it, then I do recommend Jane Plant's book, Your Life in Your Hands. And she describes her own case history where she herself had breast cancer. And by the time she got a lump the size of her fist in her breast, and she had all the chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery that conventional medicine can throw at her, and was told she had a few weeks to live, she then discovered that in China, where they do not eat dairy products, well, they didn't then, I mean, they're starting to eat them now, where they do not eat dairy products, they have virtually no breast cancer. So she cut out the dairy products and she watched that tumor regress and shrink and disappear. And she remained well for some years subsequently, but simply by avoiding dairy products. So that just illustrates the point rather nicely. It's also a major risk factor for heart disease. The reason for that is because the cow's milk protein makes for sticky blood. And guess what? We can do without sticky blood. And another major issue here is the amount of calcium and magnesium in cow's milk. 10 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. They compete for absorption. Our physiological requirement is 1 part calcium to 1 part magnesium. So drinking a lot of milk will render us magnesium deficient. Now, you need calcium for muscles to contract and magnesium for them to relax. And if you haven't got enough magnesium around, you risk the heart stopping in systole, and also other dysrhythmias. So we know ectopic beats can be simply caused by magnesium deficiency. Magnesium deficiency is also a major risk factor for osteoporosis. And I can show you a study, British Medical Journal, drinking dairy products increases your risk of osteoporosis. So lots of reasons why we shouldn't be consuming dairy products into adult life. But the main reason why I got interested in this whole business was because in the early 1980s, of course, we're not taught any of this stuff at medical school. You're taught very little that's actually useful at medical school, I now know. But then none of this stuff about food allergy was even mentioned. And of course, I just qualified, pregnant with number one, breastfeeding. Of course, I was going to be the perfect mother. And my daughter just screamed with colic for the first few weeks. And I can remember my husband then kind of getting on and saying, "You're the effing doctor, you sort it out." Anyway, I stumbled on cutting out dairy products. And not only did her colic disappear overnight, so did my chronic rhinitis and my chronic asthma. And so none of that was mentioned in a medical school, and I knew food allergy was a very real thing, not taught at medical school. I had to learn it for myself. And today, dairy products are now major allergens and a major cause of problems. And the classical history of the dairy allergic person is colic as a baby, and then they grow out of that. So the interesting thing about dairy is the allergen remains the same, but the clinical picture changes. So you start off with colic as a baby, then you move on to maybe toddler diarrhea, and then catarrhal conditions with blocked ears, glue ears, maybe chronic sinusitis. That's my problem. I had chronic stuffy nose. Tonsillitis, big tonsils. I had mine removed when I was 4 or something. Bronchitis and chest infection. So I had double pneumonia as a child. And then later on, migraine, arthritis, and of course, chronic fatigue syndrome. And very often these kids are told, "Oh, you'll grow out of this." But yeah, they grow out of that particular clinical picture, but then into another one. So instead of tonsillitis, they have migraine, and then they grow out of that and they have arthritis, and they grow out of that, whatever. So dairy allergy is a very major issue and a common driver of pathology. Anybody with any respiratory problem, sinusitis, bronchitis, chest infections, the first port of call is to cut out all the dairy products.
So low carb, no dairy.
And no gluten. Gluten is a very toxic product. It seems to be very good at switching on the immune system. And again, it's a common allergen. And again, as part of the paleo-ketogenic thing, as I mentioned earlier, we should all be eating organic diet with no chemicals. And a fantastic read is Stephanie Senna's latest book, Toxic Legacy, where she looks at the ill health problems that are driven by glyphosate, which is now the world's most widely used pesticide. We all carry a burden of glyphosate. It's so pernicious, it's so ubiquitous, it's so widely used, nobody can be free from it. So you do your absolute best to keep that toxic load down. And it's toxic for many reasons. It's toxic because it's a metal chelator. So that alone will render us deficient in vitamins and minerals. It's toxic because it kills compost, it kills mycorrhiza, it kills bacteria in the soil, and it kills microbes in the gut. 54% of the gut microbiome is glyphosate sensitive. And if you've got enough of the stuff, you will be wrecking your microbiome. And we don't know much about the microbiome, but what we do know is that the more diverse it is, the healthier you are. A third major problem with glyphosate is it's a very small molecule which looks exactly like or very similar to glycine. Glycine is an essential amino acid. Now, one of the analogies I use to explain how the body works for my patients is that, we are made up of letters of the alphabet, and those letters of the alphabet translate to words, to sentences, to books, to plays, to films, and the rest of the body. And glyphosate replaces glycine, which is like taking the letter E out of our alphabet. Now, if you try to speak a language without the letter E, you're in big trouble. And so it is with glyphosate. It substitutes for glycine, and that has huge impacts on mitochondria, mitochondrial function, on protein synthesis, on connective tissue, how well that works, and much more. And, I really think there has never been a more important time now than to eat as organic as you can possibly afford. Now, I'm very mindful that it's not cheap to eat organic, but if you've got any spare cash, that's what you should be spending it on. It's great investment for your future health. In fact, I went to a conference recently where we were discussing these very issues, and the general consensus of the conference is that most grains are now too toxic and too poisonous for human consumption. They really should be for animal consumption only.
Wow. So I'm going to just recap this, Sarah, for the listeners. You're strongly advocating a paleo-ketogenic diet, no carbs or very low carbs, no dairy, no gluten.
Correct.
What do they eat?
Well, this is the good news bit. First of all, what I recommend all my people do is learn to make paleo bread. And on my website and in my books, there is a recipe for keto bread, which is made from linseed. Now, the joy of linseed, it's only 2% carb, it's 26% fiber. And once you can make paleo bread, you then got bread. You can then make a very good pizza base. You can slice it and you can have it like a sandwich. So that's a staple of my diet. I make paleo buns, or I make paleo pita bread, or whatever. Then discover the dairy alternatives. And thanks to coconut and thanks to soya, we have some fabulous dairy alternatives. So you can get great vegan cheeses. You can get this vegan block, which is a butter substitute. I buy the Grace coconut milk, which is like eating double cream. So I no longer feel deprived from my delicious dairy products, which I adore. And they're high in fat and they're relatively low in carbohydrate. So that's preparation number one. And then of course, you can eat any vegetable, any nut, any seed, meats, fish, eggs. You can have some root vegetables, but just don't go mad with them. And the key is you're just off the processed food, you're off the junk food, as I call it. So people always ask me what I have. Well, my breakfast, I'm very lucky. I've got eggs, I've got hens, and I've got ducks. So I have 2 boiled eggs with my paleo bread. And that keeps me going all morning. I don't need to snack in the morning. Lunchtime is usually last night's leftovers, because I always cook too much in the evening. And then my evening meal is a good one. So if I have a starter, it might be paleo bread with vegan cheese, or maybe tinned fish or sardines or something like that. I have my own pigs, so it's usually pork, maybe a chop with, and again, I'm a keen gardener, so I have vegetables in the garden. At the moment, it's a lot of leeks, dog end of the parsnips and the purple sprouting. And then supper will be berries from the deep freeze. So I have blueberries, blackcurrants, strawberries, raspberries, which I have with my coconut milk. And that is very satisfying. I look forward to it. I never get bored. Now, what people love to do is they love to give me details of what they are or not eating, in order that I can judge on that. But the key is measure. And I use a ketone breath meter. You can use blood tests or you can use urine tests to make sure that I'm in ketosis. Now, you don't have to be in ketosis all the time. And in the morning, I'm often not in ketosis, because in the morning, there's a spike of adrenaline and cortisol that fires you up and gets you going and takes you out of ketosis. But that doesn't matter. So long as you're in ketosis at least once a day, that is good enough. And the reason for that is the body will always burn sugar in preference to ketones, because sugar is such dangerous stuff. It wants to get it out of the way. Doesn't mean sugar is not essential. Sugar is an essential for the body. We use sugar to detoxify the body, and that's via the glucuronidation pathway. We use sugar as the raw material to make ATP, the energy molecule, and the nucleotide bases that comprise our DNA and our RNA. So sugars are essential, but we're just overdoing them. And guess what? In the evenings, maybe I'll have 3 or 4 figs, because I adore figs. And I can have 3 or 4, and I don't need to eat the whole pound, and I'm still blowing ketosis in ketones at the end of it. So the answer is you can eat anything. It's just a case, but not dairy, not gluten. It's just a case of how much. And to satisfy the appetite, satisfy the body, I love to use lots of fats, and I love to use lots of vegetables and nuts and seeds and so on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about fat load. So which fats do you, recommend? Clean fats, presumably the whole saturated fats? And which cold-pressed oils would you use not to cook with, but to maybe throw over a salad, for example? Which way do you go with the fats? Because fat is a key component of satiety on this diet, isn't it?
Correct. Well, the fact is that in nature, all fats and all oils are good fats and good oils. The problem comes when we start cooking. Now, a saturated fat is a fairly short, tough molecule. It's saturated with hydrogen ions, which means it's straight and tough and can't be chemically altered. And those are the fats that we should cook with. Now, if you are not dairy allergic, then butter is a perfect fat to use. Very happy to use butter because it's almost pure fat. Unfortunately, I can't tolerate it, which I'm very cross about. But if you're not allergic, butter is fine to use. But animal fats, lards, and then saturated vegetable fats like coconut, palm, cocoa butter, they're saturated fats. And if you're going to cook with anything, cook with those. What you mustn't do is cook with oils, vegetable oils. Now, they are unsaturated. And what that means for the biochemist is they're missing a hydrogen ion and they are bent. They are curvaceous and they might have a bend at omega-3 or omega-6 or omega-9. And so in nature, they are curvy, they're boomerang shaped, and they're all left-handed boomerangs, and they're called cis fats, and those we use cold. Now, if you heat them or if you hydrogenate them to make margarine, then some of them will flip into right-handed boomerangs. And guess what? Those do not fit our membranes. They do not fit biological enzyme systems. They're called trans fats, and they are the fats that are very toxic. So do not cook with oils. Only ever cook with saturated fats. And oils should be cold pressed, kept cold, and used cold, drizzled on your vegetables, drizzled on your salads, or whatever. Hemp oil is a fabulous oil. It's got the right proportion of omega-6 to omega-3 in it, and I just have a slug of it out of the bottle every morning in order to satisfy my need for those essential fatty acids.
So that's the fat content. High fiber, drawing on the linseed, right? So it's a high fat, high fiber diet. Talk to me about proteins.
Well, it's the same amount of protein. It's not a high protein diet. You see, whenever I say ketogenic diet, people all immediately, oh, you mean the Atkins diet? No, I don't mean the Atkins diet. Atkins diet is different in at least 3 ways. First of all, the Atkins diet is high protein, and we don't need a high protein diet. It's a normal protein diet. Secondly, Atkins allows sweeteners in it. Now, sweeteners are not a good thing because they just train your palate to go for sweet things. And what people find as they do the keto diet and they cut out sweet things is their palate changes. I mean, when I was a child, it was always, tea with milk and 2 spoons of sugar in it. I mean, if somebody gave me a sip of that, I think I'd fall over backwards. It's just far too sweet. And again, I can happily eat berries with no sweetener on it because my actual taste buds have changed. But if I put sweeteners in it, it would make me crave sweet things. It would switch on a sugar craving, which I can do without. And the third point about Atkins is it does allow lots of dairy products, which gets the thumbs down for all the reasons we've discussed. So no, it's not an Atkins diet. It's not a high protein diet. And in my book, Paleo-Ketogenic, the why and the how, I detailed, if for those people who want to work out, calculate how much protein they have, then it's in, all the calculations are in there. But for me, I have a couple of boiled eggs for breakfast, maybe some vegan cheese at lunchtime, which is fairly, and then maybe a pork chop, a beef burger, strip of fat of pork, belly pork, piece of fish, and that gives me about the protein I need, about 80 grams a day.
Yeah, because too much protein, doesn't that turn into a kind of sugar? It effectively has the same impact as eating carbohydrate if you have too much protein.
It can. I mean, the body is not wasteful at all. It doesn't waste anything. So we need a certain amount of protein, 80, maybe 120 grams a day, depending on how big you are. And any excess protein, the liver then converts into sugar, which of course it can then use as a fuel. So no, it's not a high protein diet. It's a normal protein diet.
Adequate protein for muscle building and adequate metabolic function. Right.
Exactly. And the interesting thing about the body is it knows instinctively what it wants. And if you take addiction out of the equation, because of course that changes our desire, as I say, take addiction out, so you take the sugar addiction out, I just know how much I need kind of instinctively, and I don't want to settle down to a huge lump of steak, and I don't want to eat 3 enormous fishes or 10 eggs. I'm quite satisfied with my 2 eggs for breakfast and a pork chop or a couple of lamb chops, because they're rather small, in the evening. That's what, and say, listen to the body, listen to your appetite. Even there's a wonderful book written by a lovely lady called Caroline Ingraham called Zoopharmacognosy. Dreadful name, but what it means is animals learn to sniff out what they need for their good health and extend that to humans. And we too instinctively know by smell and by taste what is good and what is delicious. So if I go into my garden and I can't resist, taking a handful of parsley and chewing that because it's absolutely delicious, but I don't eat 10 handfuls. A few sprigs is perfect. And this is where the best cooks come in, because they know exactly how much garlic to put in, how much spice to put in, because it tastes good. And if something tastes good, then it is good for you. My next project is I want to do a course in Indian cookery.
Lovely. Well, I was going to say, though, in your case, Sarah, you've purified that, haven't you? You've got that level of kind of somatic self-attunement around appetite and food input, because you've got rid of all the toxic crap. You've purified your diet. You're not having your instincts distorted by high sugar addictions or chemical load. So presumably that's a very important step in attuning to what the evolutionary intelligences of the body is, actually getting rid of all the commodified nonsense that's forced onto us by the industrial food system.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, it's quite interesting. I was listening to Dr. Aseem Malhotra speaking the other day, who's a cardiologist, who is talking about, he's written a book called A Statin-Free Life, just demonstrating how pretty useless they are. Their benefits are almost next to zero. He estimates a 1% benefit from statins, which means 100 people have got to take it before one person sees any benefit at all. And in fact, the benefits actually may be negative. But he also goes on to talk about immunity and resistance to COVID, emphasizing the fact that the COVID vaccine is almost useless. But again, he talks much about lifestyle. And he says, if we get our diets right, then all else falls into place. And his definition of a processed food is something that has more than 5 ingredients in it. So that's quite a useful, rule of thumb if you're looking at, what you can buy in the supermarket as what is processed and what isn't. So, and if you've got something with, endless lists of polyphosphates and flavor additioners and E1s and E2s, then that's going to be a processed food. And the processed foods essentially are addictive. And they're addictive because they're carbohydrate based. They're also addictive because they're cheap and convenient. And, when we get the hunger pangs, we want something quick that we don't have to cook. We can just get it. One of the joys of being in ketosis is you don't get hungry. I mean, I eat because I'm greedy, but, once a week, I have a day when I fast and I don't eat anything in the day, and it happens to be today that I'm doing it, then I don't get hungry. I mean, I might get the odd tummy rumble, but does my physical energy run out? No. Does my mental energy run out? No. I can function perfectly well.
And important, you don't get those crashes that you get when you're carbohydrate addicted. And then you feed the high, and then you have an inevitable crash. So any comfort you get from stuffing sugar in is very short-lived and very self-destructive, is it not?
Absolutely. And this is perfectly illustrated by the distance athletes, because athletes these days are trained to run on sugars and carbohydrates. And when you see them running a marathon, if they don't eat, jelly tubes and sugars and jelly beans and goodness sweet drinks on the way around, then they crash at about 17 miles. In this country, the athletes call it hitting a wall. In America, it's called bonking. But the keto-adapted athlete doesn't need to fuel themselves. 2 lovely examples of this. Mike Morton, who holds the world record for the furthest distance run in 24 hours. He ran 172 miles in 24 hours, and he didn't need to eat at all. He had to drink fluid, obviously, and electrolytes, but he didn't need to power himself. Secondly, GP who lives down in Stroud called Dr. Ian Lake. He's an NHS GP, and he himself is a type 1 diabetic. Now, type 1 diabetics, they always need a little bit of insulin, but his diabetic control has been massively improved by eating a ketogenic diet, and he's done that for some years now. To demonstrate its efficacy, he did a 5-day fast along with Matthew Pinsent and other runners. And during that 5-day fast, he ran to Bristol. That was 20 miles every day. And during that time, he ate nothing. His insulin dose was exactly the same. His blood sugars were absolutely level, and he survived that perfectly well.
That's
so it is phenomenal. And the ketogenic diet, the point is, I can guarantee to reverse type 2 diabetes. And as we mentioned, type 2 diabetes is the risk factor for COVID, for heart disease, for dementia. And dementia is now being called type 3 diabetes, and for cancer. Cancer cells can only grow on sugar. So the ketogenic diet really is the starting point to treat and prevent all Western disease.
Yeah, especially for those listening related to chronic fatigue conditions. Lands very well. So one final question I want to ask you in relation to all of this, Sarah, is how did you come across this in relation to ME/CFS? What was it in your medical practice, in the profile of your patients, that really got you to the point where I think you are now, where this is the non-negotiable, right? Someone comes to you with ME/CFS, this is the non-negotiable, a paleo-ketogenic diet.
Well, there were several triggers, but in the 1990s, I was really asking myself, what's going wrong in patients with fatigue syndromes? And the subject that came into my head was mitochondria. Now, we all learn about mitochondria in biochemistry, mug up for the exam the night before on addictions, spew your most recently acquired knowledge onto an exam paper and hope you've done enough to pass. I'm sure you know the feeling. And the reason why we did it that way is because in the 1970s, when I was a medical student, there was apparently no clinical application for mitochondria. They weren't talked about in clinical medicine at all. We now know they're implicated in all Western disease. But in the 1990s, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if in chronic fatigue syndrome, the mitochondria are going slow. And I teamed up with the most brilliant biochemist in the world, Dr. John McLaren Howard from Biolab and then from Acumen Laboratories. And to cut a very long story short, he developed a mitochondrial function test. And what we demonstrated in a study that was published in the Journal of International Clinical and Medicine is that those patients with the worst mitochondrial function had the worst fatigue, and those with the best mitochondrial function were least fatigued. And furthermore than that, we then put in place the regimes to allow mitochondria to function best. And then in parallel with that, there's some fascinating work done by Dr. Kieran Clark at Oxford University. Now, this arose out of the Gulf War, which was the early 1990s, 1991. And during the Gulf War, a very common, or one of the most common cause of death amongst soldiers was death by friendly fire. And those occurred in frontline troops who had been told, you don't expect to be supplied for 5 days. Assume you've got to carry everything you need for the next 5 days. What did they load up on? They load up on ammunition. And by what that meant is by day 3 and by day 4 and by day 5, they didn't have enough food, they were half starved, and therefore they were making bad decisions. So Dr. Clark was asked to develop the most efficient fuel for these frontline troops. And to cut a very long story short, she came up with beta-hydroxybutyric acid, which is the ketone that is produced in the body when we metabolize fat. She then trialed it on elite athletes. I mean, the top rowers, the top cyclists, the top runners, to find that they improved their performance between 7 and 15%. Now, that is a massive increase. That's the difference between a gold medal and an also-ran. And the reason for this is because mitochondria work so much more efficiently. So little bits of information like this trickling, I then found that it's the preferred fuel of mitochondria, that mitochondria is central in chronic fatigue syndrome. And then I really started putting 2 and 2 together. So I've been using this ketogenic diet for the best part of 20 years now. And we get fabulous results with it. Now, some people, there are a couple of things just to bear in mind. Whenever you put in a new intervention, whether that's a vitamin, a mineral, a detox regime, a diet, whatever, you can expect to get reactions. Now, the homeopathic doctors call this a healing crisis. I call it DDD reactions, diet reactions, because you can get keto flu, Detox reactions, could you mobilize toxins and give yourself an acute poisoning? And die-off reactions or Herx reactions, because you starve out the microbes and you kill those, and you get allergic reactions to the dead bugs. So there's always a sticky patch to go through first. And the second, and that usually lasts, well, it can last, it will certainly last days, sometimes it lasts weeks. But if that keto flu persists for more than a few weeks, then it's possible that person is suffering from what I call ketogenic hypoglycemia, which is a dreadful term. But the point here is normally the body burns fat with thyroid hormones. Now, if you're fueling your body with sugars and carbohydrates, you're not using a thyroid hormone, so fat burning. But when you do go to keto, when you do start fat burning and burning your own fat, you do need those thyroid hormones. And if you haven't got the thyroid hormones to fat burn with, the body will fat burn with adrenaline instead. And that makes you feel terrible. And that's the wired but tired feeling people describe. They say, I'm exhausted, I can't sleep, I'm shaky and blah, 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 and I can't do this wretched diet because I'm not tolerating it. But that's often a very powerful pointer that they have an underactive thyroid. So that's something that always needs to be kept in mind.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, that's fantastic. So paleo-ketogenic diet, high fiber, high fat, adequate protein, no carbs or very low carbs, and everyone can expect to go through the metabolic hinterland with a bit of rough stuff and then come out the other side and feel much better.
Absolutely. And the athletes, the distance athletes, will improve their performance. So there's incentive for them. The power athletes, the sprinters, they do best with the two. And what I recommend with the power athletes is that they train in ketosis, but for competition, they load up with carbohydrates, and then they get the best of both worlds.
Lots of metabolic flexibility there. Thank you so much, Sarah, for a wonderful conversation. I'm going to ask you afterwards for email of the books, so I can put links to them on the podcast page, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful.
My pleasure. You ask all the right questions, so you make it very easy.
Cool.